Shas Dovos was an Onderonian metallurgist who lived 4 millennia before the Battle of Yavin. Compelled by the dark power of a Sith tome he had obtained, Dovos used the instructions provided to construct a set of Sith-style dark armor. Upon completing the suit, Dovos was accosted by the ancient Sith spirit that guarded the tome, who erased his mind and alchemically bonded him to the armor, remaking him into the Sith warrior Warb Null. Entering into the service of the Onderonian king Amen, a powerful Sith sorcerer, Null became one of his frontline fighters during the Freeden Nad uprising, Amen's attempt to reassert his own authority after the death of his regent, Sith adept Queen Aminoa, at the hands of the Jedi. Warb Null was killed early on in the conflict, beheaded by the Jedi Knight Ulic Qel-Droma. His death was ultimately deemed a small loss by his masters, who were more concerned with testing the latent power of Qel-Droma. After the conflict, his remains were secreted away on the remote world Nicht Ka, on the frontier of the old Sith Empire. Located during the Clone Wars by the Jedi archaeologist Rieli and his retainer, failed Jedi Talati Kilmamna, the dark side power of the armor seduced the bitter Kilmamna. Donning the armor and killing Rieli with Null's lightsaber, Kilmamna rechristened himself Malus, the Hammer of the Dark Side. While his brother Maul was handed over to the Sith by their mother to escape servitude to the Dathomirian Night Sisters, Savage was raised a Night Brother. Gaining a reputation as a fierce but compassionate warrior, Savage dedicated himself to safeguarding his younger brother, Feral. That all changed when he was chosen by Asajj Ventress to be her agent of retribution against Count Dooku. Physically empowered but psychologically twisted by Night Sister force magics, he was forced to kill Feral as a test, before being presented to Dooku himself, ostensibly as a bodyguard. Ventress's plan to assassinate Dooku was ultimately a failure, and Savage was forced to flee from the vengeful Count. Consulting with the Night Sister clan mother Talzin, Savage was advised to seek out Darth Maul, who had survived his defeat on Naboo. After Maul was rehabilitated by Talzin, Savage became his apprentice. Savage Opress spent the rest of his belated life as Maul's lackey, before finally being butchered by Darth Sidious, who had tired of Maul's antics and come to rein him in. In my view, Savage Opress epitomizes everything wrong with TCW. His entire existence is a pointless retcon, and his only purpose is fan service. But more than anything else, Savage Opress represents the squandered potential of the show. In his debut appearance, he was actually built up as a very sympathetic character, and his devotion to his brother was quite touching, and there was a lot of potential for development and growth. And had they done something with this, I would have been perfectly willing to accept him. But they didn't. They copy the idiotic Anakin Skywalker arc from Revenge of the Sith and have him murder his motivation for falling to the dark side immediately after falling to the dark side. And the Force empowerment ritual itself completely shits all over one of the core ideas behind the Force, that you cannot be forced to fall, that you have to consciously and of your own free will choose the dark side. The devil only does business with willing clients. Yes, he did develop a massive hatred for Asajj Ventress, but the welfare of his brother was always his first priority. He didn't surrender to Ventress so he could take revenge. He surrendered to save his brother's life. And ultimately, he never became anything more than a walking plot device, just a disposable lackey for whichever master he happened to be serving. He never took any real agency within the story. He was never developed in any way, at best just being an audience surrogate for Maul to explain his plans to. And his ultimate failing was that of the series. He had no real purpose. He didn't exist to tell a story or to convey an idea. He was just there to build hype and play for time, without any real endgame in mind. In their previous lives, both Shas Dovos and Savage Opress were very fit individuals, Dovos being a blacksmith and Oppress a seasoned warrior. Both were subjected to traumatic Dark Force rituals that warped their minds and reshaped their bodies, turning them into juggernauts of strength and power. During the course of his career, Oppress lost his left arm to Obi-Wan Kenobi during a lightsaber duel, though he was provided with a prosthesis by the Mandalorian Death Watch soon afterwards. The mechanical arm was evidently extremely durable and designed with Oppress's superhuman strength in mind, as it matched the performance of his organic right arm. While the extent of Null's force empowerment isn't as well defined as Oppress's, I think it's safe to say that they were comparable, and neither has any special advantage in terms of physical ability. On a basic level, Warb Null and Savage Opress employed very similar equipment, both being heavily armored giants who wielded great two-handed lightsabers, but truthfully there were a number of very stark differences in their kit. Warb Null wore proper Sith-style dark armor, which augmented his force abilities and possessed a partial resistance to lightsabers, though these benefits came at the cost of drastically reduced agility due to the armor's cumbersome weight. Savage Opress's armor, evidently created by Night Sister Force magics, was much lighter and allowed him greater freedom of movement, but it possessed none of the benefits of Null's suit. Oppress's armor could take blaster bolts no problem, but it possessed no special resistance against lightsabers. Warb Null's lightsaber appeared to be a simple, long-handled weapon with a lengthened green blade, providing him with greater range and leverage, but it was in truth an ingeniously constructed double-bladed lightsaber with a carefully concealed secondary emitter. As demonstrated by Malus, the intent behind the weapon was to allow the wielder to switch back and forth between the two blades in the midst of combat, confusing and off-balancing the opponent. Savage Opress wielded the traditional double saber. While the blades could be activated selectively, he typically kept both fully extended, wielding the weapon as a lightsaber staff. Whereas the mechanics of Null's lightsaber suggested a certain level of finesse and deception inherent in his fighting style, Oppress's weapon was nothing more than a cudgel in the hands of a barbarian. The nature of his weapon makes it clear that Warb Null was anything but, and that a fair amount of thought went into his fighting style. A strength-oriented power duelist noted for his martial prowess, Null was extremely adept at engaging large groups of opponents, employing wide, sweeping attacks that allowed him to strike out at multiple assailants, strongly suggesting that he had trained in the Shicho lightsaber form. And as heavily implied by the nature of his weapon, it is likely that he has incorporated Trakata-style elements into his method. However, it is also possible that Null never trained in any of the classical lightsaber forms, and instead either adapted local Onderonian martial arts for use with the lightsaber, or, like Savage Opress, employed a purely improvised freeform style. Dooku attempted to train Oppress in Makashi, but it didn't take, and he never mastered any fighting form. While not entirely bereft of skill, Savage Opress was, by and large, quite a crude fighter whose effectiveness was almost entirely due to his overwhelming physical capabilities. That being said, he has demonstrated a fair amount of cunning and ingenuity, and credit where credit is due, he has capitalized on an excellent understanding of the weapons he wielded. He took full advantage of the increased leverage and surface area of the saber staff and appeared capable of effectively negating the weaknesses of the design. However, despite his occasional flashes of insight, he is ultimately nothing more than a barbarian hefting a cudgel, and his style is best described as rude, crude, and out of control. While I think that Oppress's style, especially in his later episodes, is a good visual reference for how Warb Null fights, Null is ultimately a much more sophisticated and cunning warrior who employs a very well thought out and refined method. I'm not arguing that he is a great swordmaster, but I believe that the combination of his comparable physical attributes and his relatively sophisticated lightsaber technique leave him well equipped to engage a brute like Savage Opress. Many of the sources that talk about Warb Null refer to him as a Dark Jedi, a classification that I feel is quite inaccurate. The term Dark Jedi refers to either former Jedi who have fallen to the dark side and quit the Order, or non-Sith Darksiders in general. Warb Null never received any training from the Jedi, and he was no generic Darksider. He was a true Sith acolyte. All of his education was obtained from ancient Sith sources, and he was a card-carrying member of a Sith cult serving a fully fledged Sith sorcerer. He may not have been a true Sith Lord, but he was far more than a mere Dark Jedi. Within the Tales of the Jedi comics, Warb Null's capabilities are generally left pretty vague, so I looked to his entry in the Tales of the Jedi Companion in order to fill in the blanks. I never thought much of Warb Null before I started work on this video, so you can imagine my surprise when I saw the number of powers attributed to him, some of them indicative of master-level Force wielders. Most of his combative abilities were actually defensive in nature: resist stun, hibernation trance, and tutaminis. Powers that allow one to better guard against and cope with injury. This focus on defensive viability ahead of offensive might really set Warb Null apart from the vast majority of other Darksiders. Rather than be an unstoppable force, he was an immovable object, a rock on the seashore. Even his sole offensive ability, the Aura of Uneasiness, was largely passive, subtly undermining the concentration and focus of his opponents rather than actually harming them, essentially a downgraded version of battle meditation. Compared to the broad range of sophisticated powers that Warb Null is bringing to the table, Savage Opress is hopelessly out of his depth. Oppress's skills are limited to bolstering his force abilities by channeling his hatred, and his abilities are limited to basic feats of telekinesis. Seriously, that's all he's got. While he has demonstrated a certain level of precision with these powers, such displays are the exception rather than the rule, and he is, by and large, a blunt instrument who gets by on sheer magnitude. Given the sort of powers that Warb Null specializes in, I think it is safe to assume that he would be adept in the use of force shields in order to guard against telekinetic attacks, which would leave Savage Opress with nothing to work with. When analyzing the typical tactical responses of these two combatants, it becomes quite clear that they could not be more different. Warb Null is a fairly cavalier fighter, assuming an offensive stance and advancing on the enemy, but never charging in, content to let them come to him. By contrast, Savage Opress's entire MO was charging in headfirst and brutalizing everybody, an approach that was overwhelmingly successful thanks to his massive martial might. However, when confronted by opponents that he couldn't simply power through, he got into trouble very quickly, and was usually forced to resort to desperation tactics. By contrast, Null had a fallback option: his lightsaber. While Null never employed it as Malus did, I think that was simply because the need and the opportunity never arose. When engaging the Jedi at the Isis spaceport, he was in his element thanks to his emphasis on engaging groups of assailants, and against Ulic Qel-Droma, his defeat was so swift that he simply didn't have a chance to employ the weapon. Oppress, while occasionally insightful, is ultimately nothing more than a blindly aggressive brute, whereas Warb Null follows a thought-out and calculated methodology. Null may not have a huge array of fallback options, but he still has more than Savage Opress. So, just to recap, neither has any advantage over the other in a physical sense, but Warb Null's equipment provides him with far more options, his fighting style is more refined and thought out, his force abilities far more sophisticated, and he's a more calculating tactician. Due to his focus on crowd control, Warb Null's lack of agility isn't normally a big deal, as his enemies would get in each other's way as they try to swarm him, but it was one of the main contributing factors to his death in single combat, and for this reason I would normally place him at a disadvantage in matchups with lone opponents. However, due to Savage Opress's crude technique and tactless approach, Null doesn't really have much to worry about here, and in my view, he would be able to engage Oppress with relative ease. Yes, Oppress has demonstrated a high level of agility, but he has only relied on this trait for evasion. His offensives have been nothing more than straightforward brute force assaults. A fight between these two would be short and swift. Savage Opress would almost certainly be the aggressor coming on hard, but he would be swiftly outwitted and outfought by the equally vicious and relentless, yet far more cunning and skillful, Warb Null. I declare Warb Null the victor.